The sound of thunder cracked so close that Margaret Davis felt it in her bones, and when she looked up from adjusting her rain-soaked skirts, the wagon that had carried her and her husband across the Texas plains was disappearing into sheets of gray rain without her. Thomas. Her scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate, but the wind swallowed it whole. She stumbled forward through mud that sucked at her boots, her hands reaching uselessly toward the retreating vehicle. "Thomas, please." But Thomas Davis did not stop. Thomas Davis did not even look back. Margaret stood frozen in the deluge, her dark hair plastered to her face, her traveling dress growing heavier by the second as the rain soaked through every layer of fabric. The reality of what had just happened settled over her like ice despite the warm Texas rain. Her husband of 3 years had deliberately left her on the side of the trail, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a summer storm that showed no signs of letting up. She had known things were bad between them. She had known that Thomas resented her, blamed her for the child they had lost 2 winters ago, for the barrenness that followed. But this was beyond cruelty. This was murder, just slower and cleaner than a bullet. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the endless expanse of grassland around her. There were no buildings, no shelters, nothing but the rolling Texas prairie and the storm. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself and tried to think through the panic clawing at her chest. She was 23 years old, alone, and the nearest town, Val Verde, was at least 15 miles ahead, the direction Thomas had gone. Behind her, nothing but the settlement they had left that morning, equally far. The rain fell harder. Margaret forced herself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, though she had no real plan beyond surviving the next hour. The road had turned to a river of mud, and she slipped twice, catching herself on trembling hands. Her fingers were already pruning, her teeth beginning to chatter despite the summer warmth. She needed to find shelter, something, anything. Another crack of thunder, this one followed immediately by lightning. The storm was directly overhead now. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched the landscape desperately. There in the distance, a dark shape that might have been a line of trees. Trees meant possible shelter, at least from the worst of the rain. She changed direction, leaving the road behind, struggling through grass that whipped against her legs. The wind had picked up, pushing against her so hard she had to lean into it. Every step was a battle. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, and the cold was seeping deeper into her core despite her efforts to keep moving. The trees were farther than she had thought. Everything looked different in the storm, distances impossible to judge. Margaret kept walking because stopping meant giving up, and she was not ready to die out here, alone and unmourned. Thomas would probably tell people she had wandered off, that he had searched for her. No one would question a grieving husband. Rage, hot and sudden, flooded through her. 3 years she had given him. 3 years of trying to be a good wife, of managing their small household in Kansas, of pretending she did not see the disgust in his eyes every time he looked at her. And this was how it ended, abandoned like trash on the side of a Texas trail. She was so focused on her anger and her fight against the wind that she did not see the ravine until she was tumbling into it. The world spun. Pain exploded in her shoulder, her hip, her knee as she rolled down the muddy slope. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but her hands found only slick grass and loose earth. Finally, she crashed into the bottom, landing hard on her back in several inches of rushing water. For a moment, Margaret could not breathe. The rain pounded down on her face, and she struggled to roll onto her side, coughing and gasping. Her right ankle screamed in protest when she tried to move it. Carefully, she pulled herself into a sitting position, her back against the ravine wall, and assess the damage. Her ankle was either badly sprained or broken. She could not tell which. Her shoulder throbbed, and she was fairly certain she had cracked a rib. Blood mixed with rain on her hands, though she could not tell where it was coming from. The water at the bottom of the ravine was rising, already past her waist as she sat. This was it, then. This was how she would die. Margaret tipped her head back against the mud wall and laughed, though it came out more like a sob. She had survived her mother's death at 12, her father's alcoholism, an unhappy marriage, and the loss of a child. And she was going to die in a ditch in Texas because her husband was a coward and a bastard. "No," she said aloud, her voice barely audible over the storm. "No, I am not dying here." She tried to stand, using the ravine wall for support, but her ankle gave out immediately and she collapsed back into the water with a cry of pain. She tried again with the same result. The water was rising faster now, past her chest. Panic clawed at her throat. "Help!" She screamed, though she knew it was useless. Who would be out in this storm? "Someone please help me," she screamed until her voice was raw, until she could barely make a sound. The water reached her shoulders. Margaret tilted her head back to keep her face above the surface, her fingers digging uselessly into the muddy walls. This was really it. She was going to drown in a ravine in the middle of nowhere, and Thomas would get to go on with his life like she had never existed. The water touched her chin. And then she heard it, the sound of a horse, the splash of hooves in water. "Help!" The word came out as barely a croak. "Help, I am down here. Hello." A man's voice, deep and urgent, came from somewhere above. "Where are you?" "Here. In the ravine." Hoofbeats grew closer, and then a figure appeared at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the gray sky. Lightning flashed, and Margaret caught a glimpse of a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. "Jesus," the man swore. "Hold on, I am coming down." He disappeared for a moment, then returned with a rope. Margaret watched through rain-blurred eyes as he secured one end to something above his horse. She guessed, and then he was rappelling down the side of the ravine with practiced ease. He hit the water beside her with a splash, and suddenly there were hands on her arms, a face close to hers. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes blue or gray. She could not tell in the dim light searching her face. "My ankle," Margaret managed. "I cannot walk." "That is all right, I have got you." His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that cut through panic. "I am going to tie this rope around you, and then we are getting out of here. Can you hold on to me?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. The man worked quickly, looping the rope under her arms and around her back, tying knots that looked secure even to her untrained eye. The water was at her shoulders now, at his chest. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked. "Margaret," she said through chattering teeth. "Margaret Davis." "Margaret, I am Xander Turner, and you are safe with me, you hear? I am getting you out of this." He finished with the rope and positioned himself beside her, one arm around her waist. "This is going to hurt your ankle, I am sorry for that, but we need to move fast. On 3, I need you to hold on as tight as you can. 1, 2, 3. He called out something she could not make out over the storm, and suddenly the rope was pulling them upward. Margaret bit back a scream as pain shot through her ankle, wrapping her arms around Xander's neck and burying her face against his shoulder. He held her with one arm, using the other to help pull them up, his boots finding purchase on the slick ravine wall. It felt like an eternity, but it could not have been more than a minute before they were at the top. Strong hands, Xander's hands, lifted her fully onto solid ground, and she collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping. The rain was still falling, but at least she was not drowning. Xander was beside her immediately, his hands checking her over with efficient care. "We need to get you somewhere dry. My ranch is about 2 miles west. Can you ride if I hold you? Margaret looked up at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had thought, probably close to her own age with dark hair and strong features. There was something solid about him, something that made her instinctively trust him despite everything she had been through. "Yes," she said. He nodded and moved to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood ground tied nearby. With seemingly little effort, Xander lifted Margaret into the saddle, then swung up behind her. He settled her against his chest, one arm secure around her waist, and gathered the reins. "Hold on to me," he said, and she did. Her cold hands gripping his arm, they rode through the storm, Xander's body shielding her from the worst of the wind. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness, the pain and cold and exhaustion catching up with her all at once. She was vaguely aware of buildings appearing through the rain, of being lifted down from the horse, of a woman's voice exclaiming in Spanish. "Rosa, get the bedroom ready and heat water," Xander said, his voice seeming to come from far away. "She is hurt and half frozen." And then Margaret knew nothing at all. She woke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, could only register that she was dry and warm and lying in an actual bed. Then the memories crashed back, Thomas leaving her, the storm, the ravine, the cowboy who had saved her life. Margaret opened her eyes. She was in a small, neat bedroom with whitewashed walls and simple furniture. Someone had changed her out of her wet clothes and into a soft cotton nightgown. Her ankle was wrapped and elevated on a pillow, her other various scrapes and bruises bandaged. Sunlight streamed through the window, bright and incongruous after the storm. The door opened, and a woman of about 50 entered, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a neat bun. Her face broke into a smile when she saw Margaret was awake. "Good, you are awake," she said in accented English. "I am Rosa Martinez. I keep house for Xander Turner. How do you feel?" "Sore," Margaret admitted, her voice rough. "But alive. Thank you for caring for me." "It is nothing." "You gave us quite a fright, though. Xander Turner brought you in last night, said he pulled you from a ravine." Rosa poured water from a pitcher into a glass and helped Margaret sit up enough to drink. "What were you doing out in that storm?" The question was casual, but Margaret heard the concern beneath it. She took a sip of water, trying to decide how to answer. The truth felt too raw, too humiliating to speak aloud to a stranger. "I was traveling with my husband," she said finally. "We were separated in the storm." It was not quite a lie, though the omission sat heavy in her chest. Rosa's eyes were knowing, but she did not push. "Well, you are safe here," she said firmly. "Your ankle is badly sprained, not broken, which is good, but you will need to stay off it for at least 2 weeks. Xander Turner has already said you are welcome to stay as long as you need." 2 weeks. Margaret's mind reeled. She could not impose on strangers for 2 weeks, but what choice did she have? She had no money that was all in Thomas's possession. No belongings except the ruined dress she had been wearing. No way to contact anyone, not that she had anyone to contact. "I could not possibly," she started, but Rosa waved a hand dismissively. "It is already decided. Now, are you hungry? You slept through the night and most of the morning." "It is nearly noon." As if on cue, Margaret's stomach growled. Rosa laughed, a warm sound, and promised to bring food. She left, and Margaret lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. She was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. And she was in the home of a man named Xander Turner, a cowboy who had risked his own life to save hers. The thought of it made her throat tight. When was the last time anyone had cared whether she lived or died? The door opened again, and this time it was Xander himself. In the daylight, without the storm and panic, Margaret could see him clearly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face tanned from outdoor work. His eyes were blue, she could see now, a striking contrast to his dark hair. He held his hat in his hands, looking almost uncertain as he stood in the doorway. "Miss Davis," he said, "I am glad to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you." Margaret struggled to sit up straighter, aware of how she must look, hair tangled, face probably bruised, wearing a borrowed nightgown. "Mr. Turner, I cannot thank you enough for what you did. You saved my life." "Xander, please," he said, moving a little farther into the room but maintaining a respectful distance. "And anyone would have done the same." "I do not think that is true," Margaret said quietly. Something flickered across his face, understanding perhaps, or sympathy. He pulled a chair over and sat down, his hat balanced on his knee. "Rosa says you were traveling with your husband," he said carefully. "Is he looking for you? Should I ride out and try to find him? Let him know you are safe." The question hung in the air between them. Margaret looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band on her finger that suddenly felt like a shackle. "No," she said finally. "He is not looking for me." Xander was quiet for a long moment. "I see," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only quiet acknowledgement. "Well then, as I told Rosa, you are welcome here as long as you need. We have got plenty of room, and once your ankle heals, we can figure out what comes next." "I do not have any way to pay you," Margaret said, shame heating her cheeks. "I have nothing." "I am not asking for payment," Xander said firmly. "You needed help and I was able to give it. That is all there is to it." Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She had forgotten that kindness like this existed in the world. "Thank you," she whispered. Xander nodded, then stood. "I will let you rest. Rosa will bring you some food. If you need anything at all, you just call out. Someone will hear you." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret let the tears come then, silent and hot on her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, she realized, but of relief. She was alive. She was safe. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt the tiniest spark of something that might have been hope. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Rosa brought her meals and changed her bandages, chattering about the ranch and the men who worked there. Margaret learned that Xander had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years ago, that he ran cattle and bred some of the finest horses in this part of Texas. That he was known as a fair boss, quiet but good to his word. Xander himself visited every evening, always polite, always maintaining a careful distance. He would sit in the chair by the window and tell her about his day, about the cattle they were moving to summer pasture, about the new foal that had been born that morning. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits, to the sound of his voice and the easy way he spoke, like she was a real person worth talking to, not just a burden he had taken on. On the 4th day, Rosa helped her into a chair by the window, and Margaret got her first real look at the Turner ranch. It was beautiful in a stark, wild way. The main house was built of adobe and wood, sturdy and practical. Beyond it were a barn, several outbuildings and corrals where horses moved like water, graceful and strong. The land stretched out in all directions, rolling grassland dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. "It is lovely," Margaret said, and meant it. "Xander Turner's father built it with his own hands," Rosa said with pride. "Came out here with nothing but a dream and a strong back. Xander was born in this house, grew up learning the land. It is in his blood, this place." Margaret could see that. There was something about the way Xander moved when she watched him from the window, a belonging that she envied. She had never belonged anywhere, not really. Her father's house had been a place of fear and uncertainty. Thomas's home had been a prison. But this place, with its wide skies and endless horizons, felt like somewhere a person could breathe. On the 6th day, Xander helped her hobble out to the porch, supporting her weight as she tested her ankle. It still hurt, but the swelling had gone down significantly. The evening air was sweet and warm, carrying the scent of grass and horses, and something flowering that she could not identify. "How are you really doing?" Xander asked once she was settled in a rocking chair, a blanket over her lap despite the warmth. Margaret considered the question. "Better than I have been in a long time," she said honestly. "Though I know I cannot stay here forever, I need to figure out what to do next." "You could stay," Xander said, his eyes on the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I mean, if you wanted. Rosa could use help in the house, and once your ankle is healed, well, there is always work on a ranch." Margaret's heart gave a strange little flutter. "You would hire me, even though I know nothing about ranching. You know how to keep a house, I am guessing. How to cook and mend and all those things." When she nodded, he continued. "That is valuable. Rosa is not getting any younger, though do not tell her I said that. She could use another set of hands, and the pay would not be much, but it would be honest work and a roof over your head." It was more than she had dared to hope for. "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question came out before she could stop it. Xander finally looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "My mother died when I was 10, he said. "Fever took her quick. Before she passed, a woman from the nearest settlement came and stayed with us, helped care for her, helped my father and me after. She did not have to. We were practically strangers. But she said that was what people did for each other out here. They helped, because the land was hard enough without making it harder on each other." He paused, his jaw working. "I have never forgotten that. So when I see someone who needs help, I give it if I can. It is as simple as that." It was not simple at all, Margaret thought. It was rare and precious, and she did not quite know what to do with it. "I would like to stay," she said softly. "If the offer is genuine, I would very much like to stay and work for you." "The offer is genuine," Xander said, and he smiled. A real smile that changed his whole face and made Margaret's breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. 2 weeks turned into a month. Margaret's ankle healed, and she threw herself into work with a determination that surprised even her. She helped Rosa with the cooking and cleaning, learned to make tortillas and biscuits that did not come out hard as rocks, mastered the art of keeping house in a place where dust was a constant enemy. She mended clothes for the ranch hands, managed the vegetable garden, and slowly, carefully, began to feel useful again. Xander was a constant, quiet presence. He was up before dawn every day, working alongside his men, and often did not come in until well after dark. But he always made time to check on her, to ask how she was settling in, to share small moments of conversation that Margaret found herself treasuring. She learned that he was 26, that he had never been married, though Rosa liked to tease him about it, that he loved this land with a fierce devotion, that he was respected by his men and known throughout the area as honest and fair, that he had a sense of humor that snuck up on you, dry and understated but genuinely funny. And Margaret, despite herself, despite every wall she had built around her heart, found herself drawn to him in a way that terrified her. She was still married. The thought would slam into her at odd moments, usually when she caught herself smiling at something Xander had said, or when her heart would lift at the sound of his voice. She was still married to Thomas Davis, even if he had left her for dead. Even if she never wanted to see him again as long as she lived. The legal reality of her situation was a knot she did not know how to untangle. Divorce was scandalous, difficult, and expensive. She had no grounds that a court would accept. Abandonment was hard to prove when Thomas could simply claim they had been separated by the storm and he had searched for her. And even if she could prove it, The process would take time and money she did not have, so she said nothing. She worked, and she tried not to think about the future, tried not to acknowledge the way her pulse quickened when Xander was near, or the fact that she had started to think of the ranch as home. It was Rosa who finally forced the issue. "You care for him," Rosa said one afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen, working on preserving the last of the summer vegetables. It was not a question. Margaret's hand stilled on the jar she was filling. "I do not know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean," Rosa said, not unkindly. "And he cares for you too, though he is too much of a gentleman to say anything. But Mija, you are still married, yes." The simple directness of it made Margaret's eyes burn. "Yes," she whispered, "I am still married. To a man who left me to die in a storm because he could not stand the sight of me anymore." Rosa made a soft sound of sympathy and put down her own work to pull Margaret into a hug. Margaret held herself stiff for a moment, then crumpled, letting this woman she had known for barely 2 months hold her while she cried. "I do not know what to do," Margaret said when she could speak again. "I cannot ask Xander to wait for something that might take years if it is even possible at all, but I also cannot leave. I have nowhere else to go, and I—" She stopped, unable to say the rest. "You love him," Rosa finished gently. Margaret pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "I should not. It is foolish and impossible, and I should not." "The heart does not listen to should," Rosa said. "But you are right that this is complicated. Have you told Xander the truth? About your husband? He knows I was traveling with my husband. He knows we were separated. But does he know your husband left you deliberately? That he is not coming back for you?" Margaret shook her head. Rosa sighed and took Margaret's hands in her own worn ones. "You need to tell him the truth, all of it. Xander is a good man, but he will not pursue a married woman, no matter his feelings. If there is to be anything between you, it must be built on honesty." Margaret knew Rosa was right, but the thought of laying out the whole sordid truth made her feel sick. Still, Rosa was correct. Xander deserved to know what he was getting into if he chose to care for her. That evening, when Xander came to the house for dinner as he always did, Margaret asked if they could talk afterward. Something in her voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the conversation, because his expression turned concerned. "Of course," he said. "We can sit on the porch after we eat." Dinner was torture. Margaret could barely taste the food, could barely follow the conversation Rosa kept gamely going. When the meal was finally over, and Rosa shooed them both outside, claiming she would handle the cleaning up, Margaret's nerves were strung tight as fence wire. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in those impossible colors that still took her breath away. Xander settled into one of the chairs and looked at her expectantly, patient as always. Margaret took a breath and began to speak. She told him everything. About her marriage to Thomas, a union arranged by her drunken father in exchange for a sum of money that had disappeared into a whiskey bottle within a month. About the pregnancy that had briefly given her hope that she and Thomas might find some happiness together, and the stillbirth that had destroyed that hope. About the years of growing coldness, of Thomas's barely concealed disgust, of feeling like a ghost in her own home. And then she told him about the storm, about Thomas deliberately leaving her behind, about knowing with absolute certainty that he had intended for her to die out there. "I am still married to him," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Legally, I am still his wife. I have no money for a divorce, no grounds that a court would accept even if I did. I am trapped and I am sorry. I should have told you all this before, but I was afraid you would send me away, and this is the first place I have felt safe in so long, and I just— Margaret." Xander's voice cut through her spiraling words, gentle but firm. "Look at me." She did, and was surprised to see not judgment or disgust, but anger directed not at her but on her behalf. "That man left you to die," he said, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "He left you in a storm, alone, and he knew exactly what he was doing. That is not a marriage. That is attempted murder." "The law would not see it that way," Margaret said bitterly. "I am his property to do with as he pleases. The law is wrong." Xander stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch and back. "And as for the rest of it, the money and the legal matters, those can be dealt with. There are lawyers in San Antonio who handle this kind of thing. It would take time, yes, but it can be done." Hope flared in Margaret's chest, painful and fragile. "I cannot ask you to pay for that. You are not asking. I am offering." He came back and crouched in front of her chair, looking up into her face. "Margaret, I have been trying to figure out how to tell you this for weeks now, but I have feelings for you. Real feelings. And if there is a chance, any chance at all, that we could have a future together, then I want to take it. But only if that is what you want too." Margaret's breath caught. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "It is what I want," she said. "More than anything. But Xander, it could take years, and there is no guarantee it would work." "I have got time," he said simply. "And you are worth waiting for." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, and Margaret felt something tight and painful in her chest finally begin to unravel. The next morning, Xander rode to Val Verde and sent a telegraph to a lawyer he knew in San Antonio, a man who had helped him with the legal aspects of the ranch after his father died. 3 days later, a response came back. The lawyer would take the case, and his fee would be reasonable given the circumstances. The process, as they had known it would be, was long and complicated. Margaret had to give detailed testimony about her marriage, about the abandonment. They needed witnesses, documentation, proof that Thomas Davis was still alive somewhere and had willfully abandoned his wife. It was humiliating and painful, dredging up every terrible moment of her marriage and laying it out for strangers to examine. But Xander was there through all of it. He held her hand when she cried. He held her in his arms when the nightmares came. He reminded her over and over that she was strong and brave and this was not her fault. And slowly, carefully, their relationship deepened. They could not marry, not yet, but they could be together in all the ways that mattered. Margaret fell asleep each night in Xander's arms and woke each morning to his kiss. They worked side by side during the day and sat together in the evenings, making plans for a future that felt more real with each passing week. The ranch hands accepted Margaret's presence without question, won over by her hard work and kindness. She learned to ride a horse, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the seasons of cattle and grass and weather. She learned what it meant to be part of something larger than herself, to have a place where she belonged. 6 months after she had arrived at the Turner ranch, half drowned and broken, Margaret woke to find Xander already awake beside her, propped up on one elbow and watching her with an expression that made her heart turn over. "What is it?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face. "I love you," he said simply. "I know I have said it before, but I wanted you to hear it again. I love you, Margaret Davis, and whatever happens with the legal matters, whether it takes 1 year or 5, I am not going anywhere. You are mine and I am yours, and that is all that matters to me." Margaret pulled him down to her, kissing him with all the emotion she could not put into words. When they finally broke apart, she was crying, but they were good tears this time. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much it scares me sometimes." "Do not be scared," Xander said, wiping away her tears with his thumb. "We have got each other. That is enough." The legal proceedings dragged on through the fall and into winter. They heard through the lawyer that Thomas had been located in Kansas, back where he and Margaret had lived. When served with the divorce papers, he had not contested them, had in fact seemed eager to be rid of any legal connection to Margaret. The knowledge should have hurt, but instead Margaret felt only relief. He would not fight this. She would be free. In January of 1876, nearly a year after the storm that had changed her life, the divorce was finalized. Margaret Davis became Margaret Dalton again, taking back her maiden name with a fierce joy. The papers arrived by post on a cold, clear day, and Margaret stood on the porch holding them with shaking hands while Xander read over her shoulder. "It is done," she said, not quite believing it. "I am free." Xander turned her in his arms, his smile wide and bright. "You are free," he confirmed. "So, Margaret Dalton, will you marry me? Will you be my wife legally and properly and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" "Yes," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Val Verde. Rosa stood up with Margaret, and one of Xander's ranch hands stood up with him. It was a simple ceremony, but to Margaret it was perfect. When Xander kissed her as his wife, truly his wife, she felt the last chains of her past finally fall away. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and when Margaret woke the next morning as Margaret Turner, she felt reborn. This was her life now, her choice, her love. Everything before was just prologue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Ranching was hard work, subject to the whims of weather and market prices and 1,000 other variables. There were droughts and hard winters, losses and setbacks. But Margaret and Xander faced them together, their love deepening with each passing season. 2 years after their marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had lost one child already, and the thought of going through that again was almost unbearable. But Xander was endlessly patient and supportive, and Rosa hovered over her like a mother hen. In the spring of 1878, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, after Xander's father, and Margaret wept with joy when the midwife placed him in her arms. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Xander was besotted with his son from the first moment. Margaret would find them together at all hours, Xander holding the baby and talking to him in a low voice about the ranch, about the horses, about everything and nothing. It made her heart so full she thought it might burst. Samuel was followed by a daughter 2 years later, Emma, and then another son, James, 2 years after that. The house that had once seemed so quiet was filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of children. Margaret thrived in it, loving motherhood with a fierceness that surprised her. She loved watching Xander with their children, loved seeing the gentle patience he showed them, the way he taught them about the land and the animals with the same care his father had shown him. She loved the life they had built together, hard-won and precious. On a warm evening in late summer of 1885, Margaret stood on the porch watching the sunset, as she had done so many times before. Samuel was 11 now, helping his father with the horses. Emma was 9, and currently inside helping Rosa with dinner. James was 7, running around the yard with the dogs, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Xander came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, marveling as she always did at how safe she felt in his embrace. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret said honestly. She turned in his arms to face him, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Do you ever regret it? Taking in a half-drowned stranger all those years ago?" "Not for a single second," Xander said firmly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Turner. You and our children, this life we have built. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Margaret stretched up to kiss him, soft and sweet, a kiss that held all the love and gratitude she felt. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Xander replied. "My brave, beautiful wife." They stood there together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange, the sound of their children's laughter in the air, and the scent of home all around them. Margaret thought back to that terrified, broken woman she had been, standing in the rain and watching her husband abandon her. She thought about how close she had come to dying in that ravine, how easily her story could have ended there. But it had not ended. It had begun. Because a cowboy named Xander Turner had been riding through a storm and had heard her cries for help. Because he had risked his life to save hers, and then had given her something even more precious, a home, a family, a future. She was safe with him. She had been from the very beginning, from the moment he had looked at her with those steady blue eyes and said those words that had changed everything. "You are safe with me." And she was. She always would be. Years continued to pass, each one adding its own texture to the tapestry of their life together. The Turner Ranch prospered under Xander's careful management, and Margaret's steady hand keeping the household running smoothly. Rosa grew older, eventually retiring to a small cottage on the property that Xander built for her, where she could watch the ranch life continue around her while taking her well-earned rest. Samuel grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning everything Xander could teach him about horses and cattle and the land itself. Emma proved to have a gift with numbers and helped Margaret manage the ranch accounts, her quick mind perfect for tracking expenses and profits. James was the wild one, always getting into mischief, but with a heart so big and kind that no one could stay angry with him for long. In 1890, when Samuel was 22, he married a sweet-natured girl from Val Verde named Catherine. They built a house on the far side of the property, and Margaret delighted in becoming a grandmother when their first child, a daughter they named Rosa after the woman who had been like a grandmother to Samuel, was born the following year. Emma married at 21 to a school teacher who had come to Val Verde from Austin. Margaret had worried at first about her daughter leaving the ranch, but Emma and her husband Robert built a life in town, close enough that visits were frequent. They gave Margaret 2 more grandchildren, twins boys who were as wild as their Uncle James had been. James, true to his restless nature, spent several years working on other ranches across Texas, learning different methods and techniques. But he always came home, and eventually he settled at the Turner Ranch permanently, bringing with him a wife he had met in Fort Worth, a spirited woman named Alice who could ride as well as any man and who fit into the family as if she had always been there. Through it all, Margaret and Xander remained the steady center of their growing family. They had both aged. Of course, Xander's dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and Margaret had laugh lines around her eyes and mouth. But their love had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by shared history and the life they had built together. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1896, Xander surprised Margaret by taking her on a trip to San Antonio, just the 2 of them. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch together in years, and Margaret felt almost giddy with the novelty of it. They stayed in a fine hotel, dined in restaurants, and walked through the streets hand in hand like young sweethearts. On their last evening, Xander took her to a small jeweler's shop and bought her a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small turquoise pendant. "Turquoise for protection and good fortune," he said as he fastened it around her neck. though I think we have already had more than our share of both." Margaret touched the pendant, tears in her eyes. "We have been blessed," she agreed. "More than I ever dared to dream." That night in their hotel room, they made love with the same passion they had always shared, tempered now by deep familiarity and tenderness. Afterward, lying in Xander's arms, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You ever wonder what happened to him?" Xander asked quietly, as if he had been reading her thoughts. To Thomas, it was rare that they spoke of Margaret's first husband. The whole experience felt like something that had happened to a different person, in a different lifetime. "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "I heard through the lawyer years ago that he remarried. I hope he is kinder to that woman than he was to me, but I do not think about it often. That part of my life is over. It has been over for a long time." "I am glad," Xander said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I am glad you are here with me, that we found each other." "I am glad too," Margaret said. "Every single day I am grateful for that storm, as terrible as it was. Because it brought me to you." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content and complete. The new century arrived, bringing with it changes and challenges. The old ways of ranching were giving way to new methods, new technologies. Automobiles began to appear in Val Verde, though Xander insisted that horses were more reliable. Telephones connected the ranch to town, making communication easier but somehow less personal. Through it all, the Turner family adapted and endured. Samuel took on more and more of the day-to-day running of the ranch, as Xander's joints began to ache with arthritis. Emma's husband became the town's mayor. James expanded the horse breeding operation, developing a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far away as California. Margaret, now in her 50s, found herself the matriarch of a large and loving family. She had 8 grandchildren and counting, and she loved every moment of spoiling them in ways she had never been able to spoil her own children when money had been tighter and work more demanding. Rosa passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1902, at the age of 82. The whole family mourned her, and they buried her in the small cemetery plot on the ranch, next to where Xander's parents rested. Margaret planted roses on her grave, remembering the woman who had welcomed her, cared for her, and helped her find her way to happiness. One evening in the spring of 1905, Margaret was sitting on the porch in the rocking chair that had become her favorite spot. She was watching her youngest grandchildren play in the yard, their shouts of laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Xander came out and settled into the chair beside her, moving a bit slower these days but still strong, still steady. "Our great-granddaughter was born this morning," he said, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Samuel rode over to tell me. They named her Margaret after you." Margaret felt her eyes well up. "That is the greatest honor," she said softly. "You have earned it," Xander said, reaching over to take her hand. "You have built something beautiful here, Margaret. Not just our children, but the way you have made this ranch a home, a place where family gathers and love grows. You should be proud." "We built it together," Margaret corrected, squeezing his hand. "Everything good in my life I owe to you." "We owe it to each other," Xander said. He raised their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, a gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, but which still made Margaret's heart flutter. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Margaret thought about the scared young woman she had been, abandoned and certain she was going to die. She thought about the moment Xander had appeared at the edge of that ravine, a stranger offering salvation. She thought about every day since, every moment of joy and struggle and triumph they had shared. "You remember what you said to me that day?" Margaret asked. "When you pulled me out of the ravine?" "I said a lot of things," Xander replied with a small smile. "You said you are safe with me," Margaret said. "And you know what? You have kept that promise every single day since. I have been safe with you, Xander, in every way that matters." Xander's eyes were bright with emotion. "And you have made me whole," he said. "Before you, I had the ranch, I had work, I had purpose. But I did not have love, not real love. You gave me that. You gave me everything." As the sun set on another day at the Turner Ranch, Margaret and Xander sat together, hands clasped, watching their family and their legacy unfold before them. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and constant, and Margaret made a wish on it as she had done when she was a girl. But she did not wish for rescue or escape or even happiness, because she had all of those things already. Instead, she wished for more time, more years to spend with the man she loved, more moments like this one, simple and perfect and complete. The years rolled on, as years do. Xander and Margaret celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 40th. They became great-grandparents many times over. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's management, with James, and eventually some of the grandchildren working alongside him. In 1915, when Margaret was 64 and Xander 68, they took another trip together, this time with the whole extended family. They rented out a large hall in Val Verde and threw a party to celebrate their 40 years of marriage. The room was filled with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with friends and neighbors and ranch hands past and present. Samuel gave a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he talked about his parents' love story, about the example they had set for all of them. Emma read a poem she had written specially for the occasion. James presented them with a portrait he had commissioned, painted from a photograph taken on their wedding day, carefully preserved all these years. Margaret cried happy tears as she looked around the room at all these people who existed, because she had survived that storm, because Xander had found her, because they had chosen to build a life together. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Late in the evening, when the party was winding down and the younger children were falling asleep in their parents' arms, Xander led Margaret out onto a small balcony overlooking the main street of Val Verde. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. 40 years, Xander said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like you have been mine forever. Both can be true, Margaret said, leaning against his side. Every day with you has been a gift, Xander, even the hard days, the sad days. Because we faced them together. I would not have had it any other way, Xander said. He turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I love you, Margaret Turner. I loved you when you were young and frightened. I loved you when you were learning to be a rancher's wife. I loved you when you gave me our children. And I love you now with all the years and experience and life we have shared. My love for you has never wavered, not for a single moment. Margaret reached up to cup his face, feeling the familiar contours, the lines time had etched there. And I love you, she said. You saved my life that day in the storm, but you did so much more than that. You taught me what love really is. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You made me believe in goodness again. I love you with everything I am, everything I have been, and everything I will be. They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 4 decades of love and commitment and partnership. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. Inside the hall, their family was waiting. Their legacy, built on a foundation of love and sacrifice and second chances. Margaret took Xander's hand and they walked back inside together, ready to celebrate with the people they loved most in the world. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. They lost friends to age and illness. They watched the world change around them, technologies advancing, old ways giving way to new. But through it all, their love remained constant. In the spring of 1920, Xander's health began to fail. The arthritis that had plagued him for years worsened, and he developed a persistent cough that would not go away. Margaret nursed him as best she could, but she could see him weakening day by day, and it terrified her. "I am not ready to lose you," she told him one evening as she sat beside his bed. He had insisted on staying in their room rather than being moved to a hospital, wanting to be home, surrounded by the things he loved. Xander smiled weakly and took her hand. "I am not going anywhere yet," he promised. "I have got too much to stay for." He rallied for a time, well enough to sit on the porch and watch Samuel working with the horses, well enough to hold his great-great-granddaughter when she was brought to visit. But Margaret could see the truth. He was saying goodbye in his own way to the life he had built. One night in early June, Margaret woke to find Xander's eyes on her, bright and aware in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's heart clenched with fear, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it, my love?" "Thank you," Xander said simply, "for everything, for being my wife, my partner, my greatest love, for giving me a family and a life beyond anything I could have imagined." "You made me the luckiest man who ever lived, Margaret Turner." "You made me the luckiest woman," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I love you so much. I cannot imagine this world without you in it." "I will always be with you," Xander promised. "In every sunset, every wild flower that grows on the prairie, every foal born on this ranch, I will be there, loving you, watching over you and our family." He pulled her down to him, and they held each other close. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful together. Xander Turner passed away peacefully just before dawn, with Margaret holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around them. He was 73 years old, and he had lived a good, full life. Margaret was devastated. For 45 years, Xander had been her anchor, her safe harbor, her home. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that left her breathless, but she was not alone in it. Her children surrounded her with love and support. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren reminded her of Xander's legacy, of the love that would continue on through them. She stayed on at the ranch, of course. It was her home, and she could feel Xander everywhere she looked. Samuel and his family had moved into the main house years ago, but they made sure Margaret had her own space, her own rooms where she could retreat when the noise of family life became too much. In the evenings, Margaret would sit on the porch in her rocking chair and watch the sunset, remembering all the times she and Xander had done the same. She would talk to him, telling him about the grandchildren, about changes on the ranch, about her day. It comforted her to believe he could hear her, that some part of him was still there with her. Time, that great healer, slowly dulled the sharp edges of her grief. Margaret found joy again in her family, in watching the ranch continue to thrive, in the small pleasures of each day. She wrote down her story, at Emma's urging, so that future generations would know about the storm that had changed everything, about the cowboy who had saved her and stolen her heart. On the 50th anniversary of the day they had met, Margaret rode out to the ravine where Xander had found her. It had been years since she had been there, but she remembered the spot exactly. Samuel had worried about her making the journey at her age, but she had insisted. She stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the place where she had been certain she would die. The spring rains had filled it with water, and wildflowers grew along the edges. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. "Thank you," Margaret said aloud, her words carried away on the wind. "Thank you for that storm, for bringing me to him. Thank you for every day we had together. I would endure it all again, every moment of fear and pain, to have had him in my life." She stood there for a long time, remembering and grieving and celebrating all at once. When she finally turned to leave, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had laid down a burden she had not even known she was carrying. Margaret Turner lived to the age of 82, dying peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1933. She was surrounded by family until the end, never lacking for company or love. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren mourned her deeply, but they also celebrated a life well lived, a love story for the ages. They buried her next to Xander, in the small cemetery plot on the ranch, under the wide Texas sky they had both loved. On her headstone, Samuel had them carve the words that had defined her relationship with his father. "You are safe with me." And as the years passed, and the Turner Ranch continued on through the generations, the story of Margaret and Xander became family legend. It was told and retold, embellished and cherished, a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected places, that kindness and courage can change a life, and that some bonds are strong enough to last not just a lifetime, but through all the generations that follow. The storm that had threatened to destroy Margaret had instead led her to her salvation, to a love that had transformed her from a frightened, broken woman into someone strong and whole. Xander had promised her she was safe with him, and he had kept that promise every day of their life together. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all, not one of perfect circumstances or easy happiness, but one of two people who had found each other in the darkness and had chosen, every single day, to build a life together. A life filled with work and struggle and loss, yes, but also with joy and laughter, and a love so deep and true that it echoed through the generations. The Turner Ranch still stood, over a century after Xander's father had built it, a testament to the family that had grown from one cowboy's decision to ride through a storm, to listen for a cry for help, to save a stranger who would become the love of his life. And somewhere in the Texas wind, if you listened carefully, you could still hear it, the promise that had started it all, the words that had changed everything. "You are safe with me."